The 1930 tariff and the subsequent commercial war was a critical factor in the rise of Hitler in Germany. That's a quote from historian Charles Kinderberger. Back in the 30s, when America went into a trade war with the world, it ended up unraveling the entire global financial system. It magnified the impacts of the Great Depression exponentially. And in the chaos that followed, thousands of miles away and an ocean in between, a radical movement started to grow. It was fueled by fear and anger, triggered by massive economic pain that was felt by everyday people. And eventually, the Nazi Party rose to power. You see, when economies fracture, sometimes some truly insidious and horrific things start to take life. Hateful things start to take shape. That's what happened in Germany. Today, tariffs are back in style once again, so the question on my mind is history about to repeat itself? You see, the 1920s are known as the Roaring Twenties for a reason. GDP growth averaged an impressive 4.2%. I mean, it was a great time to live in the US, but the numbers were hiding deeper underlying issues. Income inequality was growing, debt levels were mounting up, and crucially, farmers were making much less with prices falling, and they were a pretty critical voter base. I mean, compared to today, farmers make up around 6.5% of the US's population, but back in the 20s, they were around 20%. So during World War I, many of Europe's biggest countries could not grow their own food, and that's where the US farmers had a pretty captive market. But as Europe recovered from the war, American farmers faced a pretty brutal reality. You see, prices were collapsing, fields that once brought prosperity now could barely cover costs. And with each passing season, more family farms faced bankruptcy. The mortgage payments remained the same, but the income that they needed to make those payments just vanished. Desperate to save their way of life, farming unions mobilized. They flooded congressional offices with letters and organized protests demanding government protection from foreign competition. Their message was pretty simple. The government must safeguard local farmers against agricultural imports or watch America's heartland wither away. So during the 1928 presidential election, Herbert Hoover was listening to their needs. He was trying to earn those votes. So he promised that if he won, he would put tariffs on those agricultural imports. But first, let's get on the same page on what tariffs actually are. Because tariffs are basically taxes that one country imposes on their imported goods. So the idea is that tariffs are meant to protect local industries, but sometimes the reality can paint a pretty different picture. You see, tariffs are typically paid by the importer. So let's say that the US imposes tariffs on Canadian maple syrup, for example. So if the US imposes tariffs on Canadian maple syrup, then the US company that's importing that maple syrup would then have to pay the tariff back to the US government. And the cost of the tariff is usually passed along to the consumer in the form of higher prices, because the importing company from the US in this example would have to raise prices to cover the cost of the tariff that they had to pay in the first place. So the tariffs are meant to support local communities, but when the tariff is paid by the importer, it's usually the consumers of that country that bears the brunt through higher prices. So now that we're on the same page on what some of the negative impacts of tariffs are, let's get back to what President Hoover did. So while campaigning, Hoover was mainly worried about the farmers that he'd made a promise to. And in the meantime, while Americans were still enjoying the Roaring Twenties, on the other side, Germany was struggling to recover from World War I. You see, the Weimar Republic, which was basically the name of the German government right after World War I, faced pretty crushing war reparations, and they borrowed heavily from American banks just to stay afloat. And this is where we start to see the cracks emerge that would impact the entire world. By the way, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel as it really helps me out. So in early 1928, a decade after spectacular growth, the Fed had to step in and increase interest rates. The once booming economy had slowed down, and in August 1929, the US was in a proper recession. Hoover had won the election, but he was in a pretty brutal economic situation. But remember that he promised the farmers more protection during his election campaigns? Well, he wanted to live up to that promise. So he called Congress into a special session to work something out. I mean, we know that he would come to regret this, but at the time he was pretty optimistic, and his proposal was simple. a limited revision of tariffs on agricultural imports to raise rates and boost the sagging farm prices. He hoped that this would be enough to keep his voters happy. And look, this wasn't an unusual thing in that era. In 1922, the US had put a huge 40% tariff on all imports. But despite retaliation from European countries, the US economy continued to grow. I mean, the American economy was pretty resilient in those few years, and hence the term the Roaring Twenties. By the way, I made a video on the Roaring Twenties, so do check it out here for more context. But as I was saying, tariffs were not a new economic tool for the US. And towards the end of the decade, around the time that the Great Depression got started, Congress got to work on helping farmers just as the president requested. But here's the thing. Willis Hawley, he was the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. Well, he had other ideas. He wanted to raise tariffs on all imports, not just ones related to farming. And Hoover didn't say no. And this opened the door for even more people to lobby the Senate Finance Committee to expand tariffs on all kinds of imported products. The Senate chairing this was called Reed-Smoot. Now, the House and the Senate were both controlled by the Republicans, and they had huge momentum behind this idea to raise tariffs on all products. And Hoover was also a Republican president, so, how could anyone stop them? Despite the Republican control of both houses, a coalition of progressive Republicans and Democrats fought very hard against the bill. For months they employed every trick available. They extended debates, they raised procedural objections, and they proposed amendment after amendment after amendment. The bill that was supposed to pass in weeks dragged on for over a year. But the stock market was crashing and economic panic spread. And as this was happening, the political winds shifted dramatically. The protectionists and the nationalists seized their moment. The final Senate votes were tallied, and the bill had passed just barely in the Senate, 44 to 42, but just weeks later, the House had endorsed it overwhelmingly, 222 votes to 153. So now, with both chambers of Congress backing the tariffs, the bill was officially presented to the president. Literally everything rested on one man's shoulder. Was he going to listen to the economists, or would he honor his campaign promise? It was probably the biggest decision of his presidency, one that would determine not just America's fate, but potentially the stability of the entire Western world. Now, while Hoover and the Americans were debating tariffs in Washington, all across the ocean, Germany was this fragile democracy now, and it was hanging by a thread. The Weimar Republic were forced to pay massive war reparations. They were heavily dependent on American loans, as I mentioned earlier, just to keep the German economy functioning during that period. Any disruption to this financial lifeline could be catastrophic for the country. Now let's get back to the US for a second, because while all this was happening, in a desperate attempt to prevent disaster, Paul Douglas pulled together his colleagues. Paul was a Chicago economist and would later become a US senator. In an unprecedented show of unity, 1,000 economists signed his urgent petition pleading with Hoover to veto that bill. Their warning was clear. This legislation would devastate not just American trade, but the entire global economy. But as their desperate plea reached the president's desk, Hoover faced an impossible choice between wisdom from 1,000 economists and a political promise that he made during his campaigns. As the news of the proposed tariffs spread, America's trading partners reacted from all across the world. By September 1929, formal diplomatic protests arrived from 23 nations. This kind of thing was unheard of during peacetime. It's not surprising that amongst the 23 nations protesting the tariff was Germany. Their fragile economy was desperately trying to maintain stability in the face of growing extremist movements. Now, Canada, America's largest trading partner, also warned that they would be forced to respond with counter tariffs. I guess some things just don't change. And the European nations who were still recovering from the Great War had sent urgent cables warning about their own tariffs in response. Spain, Switzerland, and Italy explicitly threatened to boycott American goods entirely. But despite these warnings from across the globe, Hoover remained unexpectedly calm. He dismissed these protests as simple threats, thinking that these foreign nations were simply looking for better terms from him. This kind of diplomatic arrogance would soon become catastrophic. Now, Paul Douglas, remember the economist who gathered his colleagues for the petition? He was actually hopeful that Hoover would listen to reason. But as it turns out, on June 17, 1930, Hoover ignored these warning signs and signed his approval for the tariffs. The proposed Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act had now become law, and it set the stage for a global economic catastrophe. Hoover's fateful signature would soon trigger a global economic war that nobody was prepared for. The tariffs finally came into effect. They arguably changed world politics forever. Tariffs were now 20% higher than they had already been. And even before the tariffs fully came into effect, other countries had retaliated. International trade almost grinded to a crawl. The stock market was already in a pretty bad way around this time, but foreign investors started to withdraw their capital from US markets, and then investors lost even more wealth. While all of this was happening, millions of people had lost their jobs. The tariffs had started to make imported goods way too expensive for them, and they had no choice but to buy American goods, and their options shrunk. The effects of this one bill rippled throughout the world. Demand slumped in other countries, and this led to the US struggling to pull itself out of depression. So the question is, how much did this actually impact US imports? They fell from around $7 billion in 1929 to only $2.5 billion in 1932, and international trade was down around 65% overall. And remember the farmers, the ones for whom the president originally started these protectionist measures? Well, their exports were down by more than 30% between 1929 and 1933. As ships sat idle in the harbors and factory orders evaporated overnight, the effects spread through American communities. Workers who had survived that initial stock market crash now found themselves without buyers for their products. In industrial towns, the sound of machinery felt silent as international orders started to disappear. Now, President Hoover, well, he was in trouble. The 1929 crash had become a full-on depression. The world had never seen anything like it before. I also did a deep dive on the Great Depression, so do check it out over here for more context. But yeah, President Hoover's response to the Great Depression had made things even worse. As American banks called in their loans to stabilize their own position, the German banking system was teetering on the edge of collapse. This resulted in further radicalization of a population that had already suffered through hyperinflation in the 20s. And then in 1932, the first presidential election during the Depression took place. It was Hoover versus FDR. Now, you'll remember that Republicans had completely dominated the presidency since 1860. But then, unsurprisingly I guess, FDR took the wind and political winds began to change. You see, FDR had been elected with this idea of a New Deal. But one of the first things that he had to deal with was this terrible trade situation. He had to work hard to reduce these tariffs. FDR had been given the powers that Hoover already had, and Congress gave him even more oversight. Now, people were obviously not happy with Hoover about his decision-making processes. And Smoot and Hawley, you know, the people after whom this act was named, they also lost their seats. I mean, it was a complete rejection of their policies. And in the wake of all of this, the US seemed to learn its lesson, I guess. I mean, since then, the country became increasingly more and more open to free trade. Well, until this year, apparently. But yeah, in the 30s, they first needed to dig themselves out of the hole that they were in. Look, the effects of the Great Depression were huge. The tariffs didn't cause it, but they made the Great Depression exponentially worse. Now, trying to make things better, FDR started to negotiate exclusive trade deals with other countries. And in the decades that followed, the US took things in a completely different direction. America wanted to take a central role in international trade, with the World Trade Organization becoming a key building block of our globalized world and agreements like NAFTA. The system went from being fairly ad hoc to becoming more rules-based, with the World Trade Organization overseeing the whole thing. In the decades that followed the Smoot-Hawley Act, people realized that protectionism can often end up having the opposite effect. It does not protect the country at all. The US gradually started to protect its interests by taking a strategic place in the heart of the global economic system. And the long-term impact of this is still being felt today through trade treaties and agreements. So the question is, what the hell is happening now? You see, President Trump is ripping up the playbook on trade that has been in place for more than 50 years. Treaties like NAFTA have had their fair share of criticism. So let's remain objective and look at both sides of the argument, because NAFTA is not a perfect system. Since it's been in effect, hundreds of thousands of jobs have been lost over 3 decades. Globalization and free trade can have huge downsides for some people, and some others can only see benefits. You see, the Smoot-Hawley Act back in the 30s was meant to boost US production and create more jobs. And I think Trump's aim is exactly that, is to help America. But given what we've learned from the times of Smoot, Hawley, and Hoover, are we sure that the consequences won't be similar? I mean, the $4 trillion that was wiped off the stock market in just a few days, could be a warning from history about the damage of tariffs as well. At the time of recording this video, Trump announced a 90-day pause on his global tariffs, and since then the markets have actually slightly recovered. Now, I haven't even mentioned the escalating trade war with China yet, because you see, many American businesses are pretty reliant on goods produced in China. Their ties run pretty deep. I mean, these tariffs will inevitably have some short-term price increases as production slows down, but we'll just have to wait and see what the long-term effect on the average American is. I mean, more than 1,000 economists signed a petition against the Smoot-Hawley Act back in the 30s, and now, almost a century later, in 2025, leading economists across the country and the globe actually have similar warnings issued against Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. Now let's get back to the 1930s for a second, because as American tariffs triggered a global trade war, Germany found itself caught in a perfect economic storm. First came their credit crisis. American banks, who were desperate to shore up their own positions, recalled their loans that had been keeping the German economy afloat since 1924. With exports blocked by new tariffs and foreign capital draining, German unemployment exploded from 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million in 1932. That's nearly 30% of the workforce. Into this desperation stepped in Adolf Hitler, offering very simplistic solutions to complex problems. His Nazi party had received only 2.6% of the votes in 1928, but later they surged to become Germany's largest political party just 4 years later in 1932. In January 1933, as FDR was preparing to take office in America, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The economic chaos that began with American tariffs had created the perfect conditions for a demagogue promising national restoration at any cost all the way over in Germany. I mean, historian Charles Kinderberger, in his landmark study, The World in Depression, concluded that American tariffs directly contributed to the collapse of the European democracies. Remember that quote that I said at the beginning of the video? It said that the 1930 tariff and the subsequent commercial war was a critical factor in the breakdown of the world economy, which in turn contributed to the rise of Hitler in Germany. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff shows how economic policies can have consequences far beyond balance sheets and trade deficits. What began as an attempt to protect American farmers ended up helping destabilize Germany's fragile democracy. As trade collapsed and unemployment soared, millions of desperate Germans turned to extreme solutions, and Adolf Hitler seized his moment. Look, this isn't just about economic history. It's a warning about how interconnected our world has become. When major economies retreat behind barriers, the consequences can reach far beyond economies and into the realm of political stability. I mean, today's world is even more interdependent than in the 1930s for sure. Our supply chains span continents, and our financial systems are deeply linked. Look, this is not to say that all tariffs are wrong or that free trade is an absolute perfect system. Legitimate concerns about worker displacement and national security do deserve thoughtful responses. But the lesson from 1930 is clear. Economic nationalism, especially from dominant economies, can create power vacuums and instability, something that extremist voices are all too eager to fill. As we navigate today's complex global relationships, we would do well to remember that the jump from economic policy to political extremism can be pretty short. Trade wars don't just affect prices and jobs. In the right conditions, they can reshape the world in ways that no one intended or in ways that no one would want. I do want to hear your thoughts on this as well. How will today's tariff war impact the global economy in your view? Leave a comment down below, and also if you've made it this far into the video, leave a $sign emoji in the comments. Also check out this video that I made about the Great Depression. It's quite connected to this video as well, so I think you'll really enjoy it. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.